The comment appears under a YouTube video about the British royal family. A woman mentions she is in her 82nd year. She grew up in Britain, and she says that when she was very young, she could tell the Queen Mother wasn't liked, that she didn't understand why, being so small, but that the impression stayed with her for 8 decades. Underneath her comment, dozens of people are saying the same thing in their own words. My grandmother always maintained she wasn't a nice person. My mother said she was too sickly sweet, too ready with the wave, a different person behind the scenes. My husband's Nan said she was a wicked, wicked woman. And every single one of these people spent their entire lives being told they were the odd ones out, that the nation adored her, that 200,000 people queued in the cold to pay their respects in 2002. So what would they know? Here is what they were never told. They weren't the odd ones out. There was a reason the newspapers only printed one version. There was a reason that version held for 50 years. And there is a documented case, dated letters, a named journalist, and a newspaper article from 25th June 2000 of exactly what happened to the one person who broke the arrangement. The Queen Mother's beloved image wasn't a misunderstanding that time eventually corrected. It was actively maintained by a press culture that had decided, informally and collectively, not to look too closely. The cost of that arrangement was paid in full by a governess from Fife, who published a warm, affectionate book about 2 little girls and was excommunicated for it for the rest of her life. Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon was born at Glamis Castle, Scotland, on 4 August 1900, the 9th of 10 children of the Earl and Countess of Strathmore and Kinghorn. She married Prince Albert, Duke of York, at Westminster Abbey in April 1923. She became Queen Consort in December 1936, when her brother-in-law, Edward VIII, abdicated. She had, she always said, not wanted the crown. What she consistently wanted, from the available evidence, was the life the crown provided. That fact alone tells you something about how carefully the space between her public image and her private self was managed across 8 decades. The public image she would carry for the rest of the century was built mostly between 1939 and 1945, and it was built on something real. When advisors suggested the princesses be evacuated to Canada, she is reported to have said, "The children won't leave unless I do. I shall not leave unless their father does, and the king won't leave the country in any circumstances." The family stayed in London. The king and queen toured bombed streets, stood in rubble in ordinary day clothes, appeared beside Londoners who had nothing left to retreat to. Those visits were genuine. Academic study of the period makes the strategic dimension of that genuineness precise. Edward Owens, in his research on what he calls the mass media monarchy of the 1930s to early 1950s, documents that the modern royal image was consciously constructed through close cooperation between Buckingham Palace, selected media controllers, and other institutions. The goal was to present the royal family as a domestic, emotionally relatable family firm. Palace officials actively stage-managed the publicity. The choice to remain in London, the bombed site appearances, the visible solidarity. These were real actions, and they were also coordinated choices, presented through a media relationship that served both sides. The press got access, the palace got the framing. Over the 50 years that followed, that image calcified. The portrait of the stoic, twinkling national grandmother was sustained not just by genuine public affection, but by the absolute reliability of what the press chose to print. The two things reinforced each other in a loop that ran uninterrupted for decades. The moment that became the load-bearing beam of the entire wartime image was 13 September 1940. German bombs struck Buckingham Palace in a daylight raid while both the king and queen were in residence. Bombs hit the quadrangle and the royal chapel. A workman was killed. The king and queen were reportedly removing an eyelash from one another's eyes when the bombs fell. She had heard, as she wrote hours later to her mother-in-law, Queen Mary, the unmistakable whir-whir of a German plane, and then the scream of the bomb. It all happened so quickly that we had only time to look foolishly at each other when the scream hurtled past us and exploded with a tremendous crash in the quadrangle, she wrote. Her knees had trembled a little bit. She was so pleased with the behavior of our servants. That letter, written on Windsor Castle notepaper and held by the Royal Collection Trust, is the closest traceable primary source for what became her most famous remark. Later that afternoon, the king and queen visited the East End. She reportedly said, "I am glad we have been bombed. Now we can look the East End in the face." The exact wording varies depending on which source you follow. Some versions use "in the eye" rather than "in the face." Oxford Reference attributes the remark to a conversation with a London policeman that same afternoon, citing John Wheeler Bennett's biography of George VI, which is itself a secondary source. The letter records the sentiment but not the precise spoken phrase. What isn't recoverable from contemporaneous newspaper evidence is the verbatim wording as it was first uttered. The phrase, as we most widely know it today, gained its widest circulation through retrospective quotation collections and William Shaw Corris's official biography in 2009, when Buckingham Palace allowed the wartime letter to be published in full for the first time. When The Guardian reprinted the letter that September, noting that the bombing led the Queen Mother to utter one of her most famous comments, the remark circulated as though newly discovered, 69 years after it was written. None of that diminishes what the remark accomplished. A single sentence, attributed to a specific afternoon, compressed an entire politics of shared suffering into something memorable and endlessly repeatable. It appeared in wartime retrospectives. It appeared in centenary coverage when she turned 100 in August 2000. It appeared in every obituary after her death on 30th March 2002. The Guardian's Anthony Holden, writing in July 2000, called it a mantra of her pearly queen hold over millions. A disaffected courtier told Holden privately she wouldn't even know where the East End was. The sentence did 50 years of work because the press culture of those 50 years allowed it to stand unquestioned as the primary fact of her character. No profile complicated it. No interview challenged it. Understanding what maintained that situation requires understanding how British press deference to the monarchy actually operated. That deference wasn't a written agreement. No editors signed anything. There was no Buckingham Palace memorandum setting out what Fleet Street could and couldn't print. Academic historians characterize it as a tacit understanding, a reverential protection of royal private life that operated through cultural self-censorship and the logic of access. The distinction matters. Describing it as a conspiracy would be imprecise, and more to the point, it would miss what was actually doing the work. The mechanism was access. Editors and correspondents who maintained warm relations with the palace received better briefings, better cooperation, and the kind of reliable supply that makes a royal correspondent's career. Those who pushed found doors closing. The Royal Rota, a pool system giving select publications guaranteed access to royal engagements, tied cooperative outlets into a structure where the cost of disruption was concrete and the rewards of warmth were continuous. A royal correspondent quoted in academic research on the Rota system put the question plainly. If you do hold them to account, Are you going to find yourself hitting more brick walls later? Prince Harry, decades later, described what he called an invisible contract between the royal institution and the British press, full access provided in exchange for improved tone. The contract was invisible precisely because it was never written. What this meant in practice was that certain things were known and not printed. The Queen Mother's drinking was one of them. Her documented daily routine, Dubonnet and gin before lunch, wine with lunch, a martini or two around 6 in the evening, champagne at dinner, was known in court circles, known to staff, and known to the journalists who covered her for decades. Her equerry, Major Colin Burgess, described it publicly only after her death as steady rather than excessive. Historian Gareth Russell wrote that she was quite the tippler, while noting that there are very few stories of her being unsteady on her feet or even slurring her words. Not one mainstream newspaper reported this while she was alive. The details emerged in biographies published after 2002. Her finances were similarly sheltered. Anthony Holden described in July 2000 how she had blithely run up 8-figure overdrafts of the taxpayers' money. With 4 palatial residences and 50 full-time servants, her multi-million-pound Coutts overdraft was effectively underwritten as part of sustaining the monarchy. During her lifetime, it received almost no sustained press attention. The single strongest documented example of this deference in action involves Princess Margaret, not the Queen Mother, but it makes the mechanism visible in a way nothing else does. In June 1953, a Daily Mirror reporter named Audrey Whiting observed Margaret and Group Captain Peter Townsend at the coronation in apparent intimacy. She submitted the story. The Mirror's editor refused to print it, reportedly saying, "We can't upset the ladies' day." No statute required the suppression. No instruction arrived from the palace. It was a judgment made by someone who understood the culture and what disruption cost within it. If that calculation was being made about the young, newsworthy Princess Margaret on the most watched day in broadcast history, the calculation being made about the Queen Mother's private life was considerably easier. She was older, she was widely beloved, and she had been the fixed star of the public landscape for 3 decades. Printing something unwelcome about her would have felt, in the culture of that press environment, less like journalism than like cruelty. So the knowledge stayed where knowledge stays when there is no route to print. It stayed in court circles and in the families of staff. It stayed in the memories of people who had stood close enough to see something the cameras never showed. None of them could compare notes with strangers who held the same impression. Each assumed their knowledge was private, perhaps mistaken, probably unverifiable. The mechanism that enforced that silence was demonstrated just once, visibly, in a way that left no ambiguity about what the system would do to the next person who tested it. Marian Crawford was born on 5 June 1909 in Gateshead, East Ayrshire. She trained in child psychology at Moray House, Edinburgh, and planned a career working with disadvantaged children in Edinburgh's poorer districts. A fortnight later, she was offered the role of governess to Princess Elizabeth, aged 6, and Princess Margaret, aged 2. She accepted for a trial period. She stayed 16 years. Those 16 years covered nearly everything that mattered in the period. She was there through the abdication crisis of 1936, when Edward VIII left the throne to her employer's unprepared, stammering husband. She was there for the 1937 coronation. She accompanied the princesses through the whole of the Second World War to Windsor Castle, while their parents remained at Buckingham Palace, organizing pantomimes in St. George's Hall to give the girls contact with other children, teaching them how to sleep in the dungeons during air raids, running a Girl Guides company on the palace grounds. She was there through Princess Elizabeth's courtship with Prince Philip and her marriage in November 1947. Crawford had delayed her own marriage twice, rather than leave at an inconvenient moment. She finally married George Buthley in July 1947 at the age of 38. On retirement, she received a Commander of the Royal Victorian Order for loyal service to the Crown. She was given Nottingham Cottage in the grounds of Kensington Palace. Queen Mary furnished it personally with antiques and flower prints as a mark of appreciation. A woman who had served longer than most could have been expected to, and sacrificed more than most had been asked to, was being sent on her way with the customary recognition for exactly that kind of devotion. Within a year, both the cottage and the recognition were gone. The sequence that destroyed her is documented in letters she kept for 40 years without using to defend herself. In early 1949, Ladies' Home Journal editors Bruce and Beatrice Gould approached Buckingham Palace and the Foreign Office, seeking stories about the princesses for an American audience. The palace refused. The Foreign Office, which believed such articles would benefit Anglo-American relations, was more receptive. They suggested Marian Crawford. Queen Elizabeth found out. She wrote to Crawford on 4 April 1949. The letter survives in full. It reads, "I do feel most definitely that you shouldn't write and sign articles about the children, as people in positions of confidence with us must be utterly oyster." The same letter granted a precise, qualified exception. A Times journalist named Dermot Mora had been engaged to write pieces drawing on Crawford's knowledge of the princess's childhood. That arrangement was acceptable, as long as your name didn't come into it. The palace wasn't refusing the anecdotes. It was refusing Crawford's name above them. Crawford's husband Buthley signed the contract with the Goulds. The contract contained a clause neither Crawford nor the palace had sanctioned. It allowed for publication without Her Majesty's consent and under your own name on terms to be arranged. In October 1949, Lady Astor forwarded a copy of the manuscript to Queen Elizabeth. When shown the manuscript, the Queen told the U.S. publishers, "The governess has gone off her head." Her private secretary sent further correspondence containing her annotations, requesting specific passages removed. The Goulds, who had found the account sympathetic throughout, chose not to pass the palace's objections to Crawford. The material ran in Ladies' Home Journal in early 1950. Woman's Own paid £30,000 for UK serialization rights and described the result as a sensational success. The book, The Little Princesses, The Story of the Queen's Childhood by Her Governess, was published by Cassell & Co. Limited in London and Harcourt Brace & Company in New York. It sold exceptionally well on both sides of the Atlantic. What it contained was this: Princess Elizabeth at 6 years old, lying in bed with the cords of her dressing gown tied to the bed frame, driving an imaginary team of horses. The two princesses buying underground tickets for the first time with their own pocket money. Elizabeth's shilling a week, Margaret's occasional half-crown, and finding the tube an extraordinary adventure. Pantomimes at Windsor during the war, with local children as fellow performers, raising between £800 and £900 for the Queen's Wool Fund. Crown jewels discovered in leather bandboxes in the castle basement. A chamber pot bearing Queen Victoria's initials pressed into service to bail a flooded boat. Crawford's account of first walking into the night nursery to find a 6-year-old giving her a long, comprehensive look before asking, "Why have you no hair?" From that first moment, Crawford wrote, she had a feeling about Lilibet that she was special. Adrian Tinniswood, reviewing the memoir in his 2018 book Behind the Throne, A Domestic History of the British Royal Household, described it as gossipy but quite innocuous by today's standards. Readers across the decades have arrived at essentially the same verdict. Crawford's affection for the princesses is evident on every page. Her loyalty to the family that employed her is consistent throughout. The contemporary broadsheet press was savage about her publication. One reviewer called her the princess's close friend and confidant, and snarled that she manifestly has clear views on how confidences should be treated. But the savagery was about the act, not the content. Even those within the royal world who argued the principle of confidentiality should have held conceded the book gave no substantive cause for offense. What the palace found unacceptable was stated plainly in the April 1949 letter. People in positions of confidence must be utterly oyster. A servant had spoken, under her own name, without palace control over attribution. The offense was independence. The consequences were total and permanent. Nottingham Cottage was taken back. The royal family never spoke to Crawford again. No letter, no Christmas card, no word. The phrase, "doing a Crawfie," entered circulation in palace circles by 1951, describing servants who spoke publicly about the household for money. It was deterrence made into vocabulary, language that told every person still in service what the system would do if they followed her. Crawford moved to Scotland and settled in Aberdeen, buying a house 200 yards from the road the royal family used to travel to Balmoral. The family drove past regularly. They never stopped. She refused all requests from journalists and withdrew entirely from public life. In 1955, a Woman's Own column published under her name, written weeks in advance by staff journalists, as her column always had been, described Trooping the Colour and Royal Ascot as having taken place. Both had been cancelled that year due to a national railway strike. The pre-written piece's exposure added a public dimension to the already existing ostracism, but the two events were distinct. The royal family had stopped speaking to her 5 years earlier. No additional cause was needed or sought. When her husband Buthley died in 1977, Crawford fell into a severe depression and attempted suicide. The note she left read, "The world has passed me by, and I can't bear those I love to pass me by on the road." She survived. She spent her final years in a nursing home. Marian Crawford died on the 11th February 1988 at Hawkhill House Nursing Home in Aberdeen. She was 78 years old. Neither the Queen Mother, nor Princess Margaret sent a wreath to her funeral. No member of the royal family attended. Her box of memories was taken into the Royal Archive after her death. The introduction to a modern edition of The Little Princesses eventually stated, "There is a consensus in royal circles that Crawfie was badly treated by her former employers. Most believe that her punishment outweighed her sin." That sentence didn't exist in 1950. On 25th of June 2000, The Observer, published under The Guardian's masthead, ran a piece by arts correspondent Vanessa Thorpe. The headline read, "Queen Mother was ruthless to royal nanny." The article drew on research carried out for a Channel 4 documentary, and specifically on a box of letters and legal papers held for decades by Crawford's solicitor, Bruce Russell, with Crawford's explicit instruction that they be released once they could no longer hurt those involved. Thorpe reported that the papers showed the Queen Mother had been secretly involved in a government plan to sell anecdotes about her daughter's childhood to an American magazine, a publicity stunt for which the nanny was pilloried for the rest of her life. The deal had been brokered with the palace by the Foreign Office, who believed the magazine articles would serve Anglo-American relations. The article published the text of the April 1949 letter. It confirmed that Dermot Mora had been engaged to write articles drawing on Crawford's material, with the condition her name not appear. It confirmed that Buthley signed the contract with the Goulds. It confirmed the payment, $85,000. Crawford's close friend Nigel Astle was quoted, "She always hoped for a reconciliation, but it never came. Crawfie was intensely loyal and wouldn't use the letters to defend herself, even though they showed she had been acting in good faith." 30 years of public vilification. And through all of it, she kept those letters. The structural point the article placed on record was precise. At the same time, the palace was arranging for royal anecdotes about the princess's childhood to be placed in American publications, paid for, credited to an approved journalist, with Crawford providing the material invisibly. It was permanently destroying the person who had published those same anecdotes under her own name. The April 1949 letter names the condition explicitly. She could supply everything, she could be paid, but she couldn't be named. The offense wasn't the content. The Goulds had found the memoir sympathetic and been surprised by the palace's reaction. The palace's own annotations asked for specific passages removed, not the whole project stopped. What the letter makes unambiguous is that the problem was the independence a signed name implies. Crawford had published without the palace controlling the attribution. The Thorpe article does not state that inference directly, laying the documented facts on the table and letting the reader reach the logical conclusion is what the piece does. But the conclusion is an analytical finding from documented evidence, not a speculation. A named primary source, a dated letter, and a confirmed payment constitute a record of the palace arranging the circulation of royal anecdotes through controlled channels, followed by the lifetime destruction of the same person for circulating those anecdotes through an uncontrolled one. Anthony Holden, quoted in Thorpe's piece, described the treatment of Crawford as symptomatic of the ruthless and brutal cold-heartedness of that family. That is his assessment, offered explicitly as opinion. What the documents established was more specific and more durable than opinion. The Guardian had been running skeptical and analytical coverage of the Queen Mother throughout her centenary year. In May 2000, David McKee noted that the BBC's decision not to broadcast her birthday parade live might actually reflect something real about a public less uniformly reverential than the Daily Mail assumed. In July, Holden's own piece on Operation Lion, the classified Whitehall document planning her state funeral for decades, observed that the East End remark had served as a mantra of her pearly queen hold over millions, and recorded a disaffected courtier's private assessment. She wouldn't even know where the East End was. The same courtier class that had enforced the deference for decades had its own private reservations. They simply didn't print them. Lady Colin Campbell, who published a book making various claims about the Queen Mother's character and background, surfaces in conversations about this period. Her accuracy record is uneven. Mainstream biographers, including Hugo Vickers, have rejected her more dramatic claims about the Queen Mother's parentage as complete nonsense, and historians have described her Queen Mother material as built primarily on anonymous or hostile sources without independent verification. Some of her earlier Diana-related claims were later corroborated elsewhere, which is why she attracts a degree of advocacy. Her work counts as disputed testimony that circulates in the debate, not as primary evidence for the specific documented case described here. The shift in how the public understood the Queen Mother's image didn't happen because new documents surfaced. Marian Crawford's story had been available since Channel 4 aired the documentary on 25 June 2000. The Shawcross biography put the full text of the wartime letters into public circulation in 2009. Neither development alone produced the change in perception. What changed was that dispersed private knowledge could finally aggregate. Before the internet, the testimony that circulated inside families stayed inside families. People who had worked near the palace, or whose parents had, or who had simply observed over decades and carried a different impression, they held that knowledge without any way to compare notes with strangers who held the same thing. Each person who privately remembered a version of the Queen Mother different from the one in every centenary spread assumed their recollection was personal, perhaps colored by some family attitude, possibly wrong. The official version was in every newspaper, every documentary, every anniversary feature. Their version was at the kitchen table. Then comment sections appeared, and the kitchen table went online. Reddit threads about the crown accumulated responses from people drawing on family-transmitted accounts. YouTube videos about palace staff gathered comment sections where the pattern, "My grandmother always said," appears from commenters across different families, different counties, different decades of memory. People who had clearly never met and had no way to have coordinated their testimony. The person who heard one version from a grandparent who had worked near the palace in the early 1950s discovered, in a comment thread years later, that someone else's grandparent from a completely different region and a completely different household had said much the same thing. Nothing was proved by that convergence in an evidentiary sense. No new document surfaced. No senior member of the household broke cover in any verifiable form. What happened was quieter and, in terms of how public opinion actually shifts, considerably more consequential. People who had privately doubted the official image found each other and discovered that the doubt was far more widespread than any of them had been permitted to know. The image had persisted for 50 years, partly because the people who didn't share it had no means of measuring how many of them there were. Each person had been told, implicitly or explicitly, that the nation adored her. Each person knew about the 200,000 who queued. None of them could see the others who had stayed home, carrying a different account in their pockets. She is 82 years old, and she has been quietly right since she was a child. That is the whole story, really. Not a conspiracy. Nobody signed anything. Just an arrangement so ordinary that everyone inside it thought it was manners. The editors knew. The staff knew. The families of the staff knew, and told each other in kitchens, at weddings, at funerals, in the voice adults use when children are in the room. And for 50 years, none of it could reach print. So every person who had noticed assumed they were alone. They weren't alone. They were simply early. And the only thing that finally changed was that the grandchildren got somewhere to write it down and discovered that 10,000 other families had been saying it too. Marian Crawford left a box of memories with her solicitor for 40 years, with instructions that it be released once it could no longer hurt those involved. The letters inside it, published by Vanessa Thorpe in The Observer on 25 June 2000, showed a palace that had approved the circulation of royal anecdotes through controlled channels and destroyed the person who circulated the same anecdotes through an uncontrolled one. The Queen Mother died on 30 March 2002. 200,000 people queued in the cold to pay their respects. That affection was genuine, and it had genuine roots. The question was never whether she was loved. The question was whether the picture the public received was the complete one. The answer is documented, named, and dated. The 82-year-old woman in the comment section didn't need an archive to know it. She'd known it since she was small. She just hadn't had anywhere to write it down until now. If stories like this are what you're looking for, subscribing means there are more where this one came from.